classroom. So I love the classroom, and I haven't been in it since I came to Kuiper. And what's also kind of fun is the two workshops or lectures I sat through previously, you know how your mind's just weaving through things. It's like, yeah, that makes a great connection to what I'm going to be talking about, Branson. Thank you. And Carol, that was really good. Thanks. And so hopefully today you're having that same sense where what you're hearing in one room is fitted well and kind of spurring you on to some ideas in another section that you're listening to. And that's a good thing that's happening today. I'm excited for that. Just a little backstory. A couple of backstories. One is the title. Some of you have, if you don't have my abstract, Andrew has more there. And it's called Hearing the Voices of Those Who Are Educating for Shalom. This is not a seance, okay? And this is not a whisper session, but this is listening to what other people have said about educating for Shalom. And you will be listening because I have not prepared, and this is probably the first time I've ever taught or lectured that I don't have anything prepared as visual aids. But my toggle to my computer is still packed in a box that came from Manila, where we lived. And I'm looking forward to this weekend finally getting my hands in those boxes. So I was kind of left without a lot of situations there. So that's the title. Another backstory is just kind of how I got to this. Because what I'm going to present is some overview of my doctoral dissertation. But it wasn't just the dissertation. It was kind of like all that came before that. Because if you're going to spend that much time and energy, you got to kind of love and be interested in what you're doing. And so I've spent the last 15 years working at Asian Theological Seminary in Manila, Philippines, and I taught in biblical studies. So I taught Old Testament mainly, and I taught biblical Hebrew. I also taught education courses, and then I also served in leadership as the vice president. And so over those 15 years, I had a lot of different experiences. And so things like the word shalom started percolating long ago. And so that was laying there. And then just through my educational experiences, I came across people like Nicholas Walterstorff. Back in the 1980s, when I was studying education at Calvin College, and he was a professor there, I read his stuff. So that was another piece of the puzzle. And then when I did my doctoral work, I had to do something for a philosophy of education course. And his anthology or essays of Educating for Shalom just kind of fused those two ideas together. So I started reading more about Nicholas Walterstorff and liked what I heard. And that got me interested. And from there, you just keep building on it until you say, you know what, maybe I want to spend a little bit more time doing this kind of thing for my dissertation. And that's kind of been the work of that. But the most significant piece was that Dr. Walterstorff, who is now about 81, 82 years old, is a very gracious, generous scholar. And he spent 2 weeks a year ago, June, with the Association for a More Just Society. And I was one of 20 global scholars that participated with him, and he was our leader. So I got to spend 2 weeks with him, listening firsthand, and what a gift that was. And out of that, he was then willing to kind of take part in my dissertation. So one whole chapter of what I did is an email communication he and I had back and forth with each other. And so that was a very special thing because I got to hear firsthand, not just from his writings what he was talking about, and not just from the voices of all these other people I was looking at, but I could take those two things, merge them together, and come out with a whole bunch of questions and say, so Nick, what do you think now, 30 years later, about what you said? And what do you think about all these people are saying about what you're talking about? And that was very exciting, and he was very gracious in doing that. So that's kind of the gist of from where I've come. And obviously with only the 25, 30 minutes we have, we can't get through a lot. But I hope to give you some type of an overview of what I went through, just to help you start thinking about what might it mean to educate for shalom. We talk about a lot of taglines. Kuiper has taglines. Other colleges have taglines. You could probably Google this weekend, college taglines, come up with the whole list. Do we live those out? What do they mean? Well, and I'm presenting one that can become a motto for education, to educate for shalom. Maybe you've never thought about it. We talk a lot about integrating faith and learning. We talk a lot about developing a biblical perspective or a biblical worldview. This kind of fits in there, but it goes a little bit different direction. So that's what I want to present. But first for the story. While visiting China, Sister Alex Camille, a Carmelite nun, noted that her Chinese guide, John, made every effort to point out the Chinese word happiness wherever it showed up. In the marketplace, in the temples, on billboards, at shrines, historical sites, on clothing. Happiness. Jen even mentioned that some Chinese emperors chose the title Guardian of Happiness or Eternal Happiness as their title. Sister Alex reflected on this. The notion of happiness, she thought, almost seemed inescapable in the Chinese culture. I wondered why so much emphasis was placed on such a relatively fragile goal. In spite of language barriers, she attempted to discuss these thoughts with her guide. Jan smiled and explained that happiness is far more than feeling good, kind of that American idea, or what you get out of life. He said happiness is everything. After some reflection, Sister Alice concluded Jan's views of happiness seemed rather close to her understanding of the Hebrew word shalom, or the English equivalent, peace. Not sure how to bridge the language gap in their conversation, she wanted to discuss this more deeply. Sister Alice then held up 2 fingers to make the 1960s peace symbol. And she said, happiness is fullness. It's God's blessing. It's the way life is supposed to be. And Jen smiled broadly and shook his head vigorously and said, yes, that's what we mean by happiness. Not just feelings. It's all that makes life good. Well, in this brief and choppy linguistic labyrinth, John and Alice made a deep connection. 2 very different cultures pursuing happiness met and shared an essential human learning and purpose. One explicitly expressed through an American right, the pursuit of happiness, and the other implicitly woven through Chinese culture and centuries of it. For these 2 individuals, happiness was unearthed to mean the deep peace of having what is needed for well-being. Their encounter yielded tangible expressions of flourishing and shalom. Sister Camille's story suggests that the desire for happiness, or what she would like to term shalom, is widespread culturally and historically. Human beings long for purpose and wholeness and life the way it's supposed to be. Over the past 30 years or so, the idea of shalom has been finding its way into Christian higher education, and mainly through the writings and the speaking of Dr. Nicholas Wolterstorff, whose collections of essays is entitled Educating for Shalom. Wolterstorff asserts the centrality of the biblical concept of shalom as the mission, vision, and purpose of Christian education. He defines shalom, which encompasses wholeness, flourishing, delight, the state of affairs when everything exists in right relationship with everything else, God, humanity, and nature. He presents shalom as the visible and tangible reality of the reign of God in the world and the purpose for the Christian church. Christian educational institutions and educators have been called to exhibit, equip, and educate for shalom, he says. While Wolterstorff does not intentionally develop a model of shalom, he gives us no framework to say this is the way it's supposed to look, folks. He's a philosopher. He likes to think about it, abstract about it. What he does is he's given his speeches and his articles, and through all of them he addresses a multiplicity of topics that give shape to such a model. So a person like Dr. Clarence Joldersma, a philosophy of education professor at Calvin, in his introduction to Educating for Shalom, suggests that Wolterstorff's treatment of shalom has somewhat of a comprehensive framework. And he suggests that Wolterstorff speaks into educating to shalom in several different ways. And this is what I picked up. Because as I started listening to all these voices that were echoing and attributing to Wolterstorff this idea of educating for shalom, I had to try to piece these together in some type of framework to make sense out of them. What are they saying? In what categories and subject areas are they speaking the same and different? So Joel Dersma helped me out there. And what he helped me to see is that Wolterstorff speaks about educating for shalom in basically 5 areas. He talks about in a big picture area. It's the goal and purpose of Christian higher education. It's your mission and vision statement. Educate for shalom. Then he gets a little bit more specific. It's also involved in helping raise and analyze the social context to help students become globally and socially conscious, to help them learn how they fit into culture. That's educating for shalom. The other is something dear to Wolterstorff's heart, and that's the whole idea of scholarship. To educate for shalom means to give room for academic freedom and scholarship and how we go about learning. And he writes on those issues. And then he gets a bit more practical once in a while because he did a lot of work with curriculum. And so he talks about educating for shalom and how that looks when you put a course together. What might happen when you teach towards educating for shalom, if that's one of your learning outcomes. And finally, it has to do not with the what stuff, but with the who stuff. Who are we as teachers and learners? So what about my pedagogy? What about my approaches to teaching? How will I teach towards shalom? Now that's all very large. And Wolterstorff never sets out, and he says this to me in an email, I never set out to talk about all this. It just was so implicitly in who I was and what I was thinking and how I was seeing the world and my place as an educator and philosopher that all of these things just started spilling over. And so of course it's a big picture, but it also is very much about our scholarship, about the way we put courses together, about how we teach, about how we raise consciousness. And so those 5 categories then helped me group these voices that we're going to be hearing a bit about. But back to Wolterstorff. Initially, these ideas and his writings percolated among a small group of like-minded educators, kind of like we're doing here. He spoke to the choir. And they were mainly people holding a Reformed perspective and tethered to Calvin College because he was a philosophy professor there for 30 years. After that, he went on to Yale University and the Free University of Amsterdam. He took his ideas, of course, with him as well. But in recent years, talk of educating for shalom is being shared and implemented by a broader spectrum of voices worldwide. The spectrum is much like the metaphor of a pebble being dropped in a pond, and what happens? Those rings start to form circles and they start to enlarge. That's kind of like this idea, like most ideas, right? This idea of the educating for shalom. It started small with a group of like-minded thinkers, and ever since then it's been spreading. And I tried to follow that in a bit of a sleuthful way. I was very curious, where did it get started? How did it spread here? It's hard to find that out, but I tried to interview some people to do that, and a lot of it had to do with someone like Nick Wolterstorff, who just speaks in a variety of places all around the world and takes these thoughts with him. But other ways, voices continue to come from those connected to places like Calvin College and the Christian Reformed Church of North America and the Reformed Church and the Presbyterian Church because we share a similar perspective. And so you have other people writing in those circles about educating for shalom. Joel Carpenter from the Kyers Institute of Learning, Harry Fernhow, who was the former president of the King's College University in Canada, Michael Goheen, who is now at Calvin Seminary, Richard Mao, who, if it all turns out, may even make a visit to Kuiper this year, right, Ken? And others are speaking this language, okay? But also that pebble enlarged. And so as it started among a few like-minded people, it started to gather a little bit of momentum. And through networks like the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, we call that the CCCU, it's about 145 colleges, kind of like Kuiper, okay, across North America and abroad that kind of have a similar vision and mission to higher education. And we have faculty development and email services and leadership programs and books are published. An organization like the CCCU started perpetuating some of this idea of educating for shalom. Professional conferences, talks like this, book publications, course syllabi were being formed. People were sharing that. At Whitworth University, a whole group of professors from there and other universities as far as Pepperdine to the East Coast put together a very large syllabi on educating for shalom. So it's catching on. And that got me interested in what are people saying and what do we mean by educating for shalom. Beyond the rings of the CRC and the CCCU are more voices linked to other Christian groups and institutions in North America and around the world, speaking about the impact of educating for shalom as far away as Australia, Canada, Singapore, the UK, and Nigeria. And through other organizations like IAPCHE, the Institute for the Advancement and Promotion of Christian Higher Education, which is largely now a global movement. These national leaders that are not Western are also embedding this idea of educating for shalom within their context. So like the conversation between Sister Camille and her guide Gian, this study presents the voices of those who are educating for shalom and describes the overlapping meaning of this phrase and the ways in which they're implementing their ideas that lead us to an institutional vision. Who do we see our school becoming? Who do we want to be? Missional goals, how are we going to go about doing this? And educational models, the curriculum, the pedagogy. This ever-expanding circle of Christian higher educators acknowledges Christian philosopher and educator Dr. Nicholas Wolterstorff as the catalyst for this idea of educating for shalom. So all of the people I looked at, over 100 voices, I all made sure they referenced back to him. He was the one that they went to as the source for this idea of educating for shalom. That's how I boundaried my research. I didn't use peace and reconciliation studies. I didn't go to other groups. I didn't go to K through 12 schools. I just focused on Christian higher education. Wolterstorff's writings on what it means to educate for shalom are fused with and propelled by his personal experience of injustice and justice, of shalom and its absence. Here's a Christian philosopher, brilliant, written some stuff that's difficult to read. And when I heard him personally say, it wasn't so much about my study, it was about my heart being pulled toward justice and injustice that really got me thinking about shalom. He speaks, in fact, in the afterword of one of his books as having these experiences were the burr under his saddle, quote unquote, that prompted him to move beyond the status quo of academic learning and writing. In both his afterword and in a journal article, How Social Justice Got to Me and Why It Never Left, Wolterstorff reflects on the issues and experiences, or what he calls the epiphanies, in his words, that brought about such developments in his perspective. Wolterstorff tells that in 1976, okay, it's a long time ago, on behalf of Calvin College, he attended a conference in South Africa. Okay, this is the apartheid years. And where he comprehended firsthand the impact of apartheid. He found himself caught up in a heated, ongoing argument between white South Africans and black South Africans. And one evening, following the conference in Pretoria, his epiphany came through a personal encounter with a black South African who poured out his pain and anguish. And Wolterstorff returned home, he says, with fire in his belly and a call received from God to speak as a prophet for the cause of injustice and shalom. 2 years later, and you should hear him tell this story, 2 years later, for no reason he can put together, except we said God's providence, he was invited to speak at a conference in Chicago on Palestinian human rights. The outcome was more than a deja vu of his experience in South Africa. It reiterated God's call for him to speak up for the wronged of the world, to find his prophetic voice, like the voices of the biblical prophets, who spoke a message of shalom in the midst of injustice. As a philosopher and educator, Walter Storff's academic learning shaped his experiences, but even more, as a Christian who found his prophetic voice, his experience shaped his academic learning. And he wrote to me as I asked him for more details on this. He wrote to me and said, when I was coming home from South Africa in the plane, I was so torn apart. I was so fragmented looking at my life and how I was giving my time to all these different things and wondering how, as a philosopher, can I speak on behalf of justice and injustice? And that's what he gave thought to. And I said, so what did you do? And he says, I did what any philosopher would do. I bought every book I could find on justice and injustice, and I read them all. And he says, and then he says, but first I did a study of Scripture and tried to see what the biblical perspective was on all of this. So a little bit about that in my findings. Walter Storff approaches Scripture and the understanding of the biblical concept of shalom with the same attitude that Jewish Old Testament scholar Abraham Heschel urged Christian theologians when he said, the great challenge to those of us who wish to take the Bible seriously is to let it teach us its own essential categories, and then for us to think with them instead of just about them. And so he started to steep himself into the Old Testament, into the New Testament, and tried to think, what does this idea of shalom mean there, back then? What's the story behind this? What was God doing? What are the prophets preaching to? What are the Psalms explaining? What do the stories depict? What is not happening? And so here's a philosopher that's saying, I went to Scripture, and that's where I found my foundation. And then I started letting it permeate my thought system. Again and again, he stresses the importance of situating this idea of shalom within Scripture and having the biblical context provide the overarching shape and meaning to the phrase, educating for shalom. So while, and we're not going to have time to talk all about shalom, I'd love to, but the semantic field of a word in Hebrew like shalom is very broad and wide. There's not just one definition. And it's layered in the use of how it is and over the centuries of how it was used in the biblical text. But Walter Storff considers the word flourishing, as an appropriate English equivalent. We often say it's peace, but peace sometimes just we think of as the absence of war. And that's not what shalom is necessarily intending. It's just a piece of it. Okay, shalom is beyond that. It's getting life the way it's supposed to be. Knowing it's an already not yet, but it's that flourishing part. So Walter's listening to the Old Testament prophets. Walter Storff hears a message of justice, where all people have the right to flourish and to enjoy their rights within a just and responsible community that he describes as the ground floor of shalom. Justice fits there. He has written a lot. 2 latest books are all about justice, if you're interested in that area. Walter Storff also recognizes that shalom involves establishing harmonious relationships with God, others, and the world in order to bring about flourishing. Walter Storff understands that shalom is both a gift of God. Okay, God, in even the Aaronic blessing, he's blessing them with shalom. Okay. But it's also our responsibility as humans to carry it out. And so it's initiated, he says, at creation. He wants to see the creation mandate as a command and a blessing. Go and flourish. Living under such a blessing, Walter Storff sees shalom as bringing delight and gratitude, whereas the absence of shalom is lament and suffering. And he, of all people, would know this because he wrote a very thin book. And I don't know, Diane, if we have this in the library, do we? It's a remarkable little book called A Lament for a Son, because his son was a year or 2 older than me. We were in the same high school, and he went off to college, and he died in a mountain climbing accident. And so Dr. Walter Storff lost his son at a very early age and had to deal with that as the thinker, Christian that he is. And so this little book, Lament for a Son, the sense of there was no flourishing there, in a way, is his response. While Waltersdorf understands the eschatological perspective of shalom, it points to a vision of shalom when you read the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Joel, which will be fully realized when Christ makes all things new. He never strays from focusing on the earthly, the tangible expressions of shalom here and now. He echoes the images that the prophets share of shalom being full, like red wine, like the garden of delight. And if you read the Old Testament, often the images of shalom are earthly images of gardens and wine and fullness and fruit and blessing and fertility. That's the idea, the sense of flourishing, of bounty, of blessing. In these images, in the multifaceted description of shalom that Waltersdorf tethers to the context of educating, these provide the phrase, educating for shalom. So Waltersdorf's idea of educating for shalom grew out of giving careful thought to some life situations and injustices involving Palestinians, Black South Africans, and others. And he realized that shalom, that idea, is the most promising concept for capturing God's and our mission in the world. He sees the world through shalom. He says that's what God has called us to, and that's what we're to act out of. And so it becomes a very comprehensive framework for him. Waltersdorf shares that it soon becomes obvious to him, quote, that if one thinks that shalom is this all-embracing category for the Christian life, then what we have to do is educate for shalom. If we're called as Christians to live out and bring about shalom, then he says, as an educator, I just start asking myself, how do we do that right here? What does it mean at Kuyper to educate for shalom? The genius of Waltersdorf's contribution to education is that he doesn't settle with status quo interpretations of the distinctives of his Reformed tradition, but he authentically and arduously pursues the meaning and the implications of shalom from a biblical perspective that prophetically speaks to today's context. So he roots himself within the tenets of a Reformed perspective, but he tries to think out from there within a biblical perspective and looking at today's culture. Waltersdorf's declaration that all other models of Christian education are deficient becomes his call for a more comprehensive model that envisions shalom and incorporates all of learning. Very Kuyperian there. The arts, the professions, worship and piety, along with dealing with humanity's wounds. All of this comes under the idea of educating for shalom. In our email conversation, this is where I kind of poked at him, because I said, when I was in my philosophy of education course in 1980 at Calvin College, we read your fresh off the press book, Educating for Responsible Action. And I said, how did you move in 30 years from educating for responsible action, which is a very different idea, to educating for shalom? And then he went through the story of what changed in him from looking at it as an action to then he moved to looking at it as more of a behavior or perspective, educating for a worldview, to now saying those are all good, but he really believes educating for shalom incorporates all that. And while it may seem tenuous and hard to nail down, he feels that's the vision we need for education because it allows for what God calls us to do through Scripture. He more often speaks of the vision of shalom than a model of shalom education, as he accentuates the different parts of his framework, particularly in terms of justice. And he speaks to all these different areas. So what I did in my study was I looked at all these different people, educators, leaders, university presidents, classroom instructors, that did all of this work on educating for shalom, and I just started to look at how and what are they saying that connects with what Waltersdorf is saying about educating for shalom. And do we then have something of a movement happening? Is there legitimacy and is there inertia in this idea, this motto, that we can move forward and say, yeah, we need to stop and think, what does it mean to educate for shalom? This is not just a cliche. It can become one. We can put it on our tagline, we can put it on our website, we could put it on our calling cards. But Wolterstorff wants to say we need to live with that in the way we look at the purpose of higher education, in the way we look at how we teach and how we plan our courses, and how we go about learning and scholarship, and how we want to relate and help our students relate to how they become global citizens in this world, and what does that mean? So it was exciting to read all these different voices. Some were Christian educators and professors that would bring a group of students, kind of like the street ministry stuff, down into New Orleans, into a Katrina-hit neighborhood, and help them deal with issues. And they would talk then about, how do you get your life to flourish? What does it mean to be putting your life back together after Katrina, and how do you act that out? Because they were a theater arts group. Others talked about this in terms of the big picture. One college made a whole document, their annual report. The title of it was Educating for Shalom. So everything that went out that year had that title on it because they were trying to get people to think about that. If you go on Calvin College's website and you click under identity, there's a whole page that comes up. Talks about educating for shalom. My question in all of that is, does it have impact? Is it influencing and affecting our lives, and how would we measure that? How are we carrying this out, and what can be done in small ways and in large ways? And ultimately, what do we mean when we talk about educating for shalom? What are some of those outcomes? How will it change the way we look at ourselves as a community? And the way we look at others outside of this community? What does that mean to live in shalom? What does it have to do with the way we relate to each other as colleagues? Or the way we develop programs? Or how we look at where we're going to serve once we graduate and take that idea with us into the marketplace, or the pastorate, or the boardroom? And so I think Wolterstorff is onto something, and yet he wants to caution us to say, let's be careful not to just have this be a motto that's on our lips, but let's think hard and long about situating it within Scripture and studying, what does God intend life to be? And then how will that intention be shaped, or how will our education shape those intentions so that we can go about educating for shalom? I want to just read you one question in my Q&A with him, because it might give you a little window into some of the practicalities, being that he's a philosopher. Because you're going to want more, right? You're going to want the nuts and bolts. He doesn't offer that, but a lot of these other people that have worked with his ideas do. But this is what I asked him. I said, as you think back on your years of teaching philosophy, can you share how you pursued educating for shalom? I said, for example, did you think about this idea as you put your curriculum together, or did scholarship, led class lectures and discussions, mentored students or new faculty members? And Wolterstorff's reply shows his sincere intent on educating for shalom within the context of philosophy. This is what he says. And this is unedited stuff. He says, I never taught courses in social ethics, but I have certainly spoken and written a lot on the topic, in particular justice. And I've thought of my lecturing and my writing on justice as contributing in some way to shalom. Some of philosophy is purely abstract. Metaphysics, epistemology, for example, he says. I have written on those too. And I think of those ideas as contributing to understanding, contributing to what the Old Testament writers call wisdom. And wisdom, he sees, as a component of shalom. It brings about flourishing and fullness. But much of my philosophy, he says, is also concerned with what I sometimes call healing our concepts. So this is Dr. Wolterstorff, philosopher, saying, when I go into my philosophy classroom, I'm thinking about healing our concepts. That's how I bring shalom. He says it doesn't work with nurses, probably in the same way as with engineers and philosophy students, but that's the idea. So I want to challenge you, as we got a lot of colleagues here, And students, give some thought. What do you think it means to educate for shalom? And is there room to do that kind of thing at Kuiper College? Just one thing really quick. Just Sunday's paper? No, last week Thursday. A whole article about hope. I found it very interesting because I think shalom is one of those words, because it's a biblical word, that we can have a lot of conversation with each other, not only here but across boundaries. And this is what Pope Francis says. He summed up the church's mission succinctly, quote, "I see clearly that the thing the church most needs today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful." And I think Nick Walterstorff might say, yeah, we're kind of onto something together here that has something to do with shalom. So thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. We're going to have a few minutes for questions and question and answering with her response, and then so thank you.
Andrew?
I'm going to ask you the tough question. You said, what does shalom look like at Kuiper College? Difficult nuts and bolts. Do you have even just one specific thing? I know you can't capture all of it, but give me ideas to tell us what specific thing you can educate for shalom.
You know, on Wednesday, the president and I, Ken from Advancement, Dale, and Wayne Bross from Finance, we had an off-campus strategic planning day. And one thing we talked about was our mission, our vision, and our values of Kuiper College. And a value there that kept percolating in our conversation was the last value on Kuiper's list. It was that we're a caring community. And I guess coming in as a newbie, I think that's something that we care for each other. We are about wholeness, about helping each other flourish, about establishing right relationships with each other as a community and as individuals. And I think that's a gift. I think that's an attribute of Kuiper College that I certainly coming in new and thankful for. But yeah, let's keep that conversation going, because there's lots of ways to look at it.